Canada is not often thought to share a history of slavery with the United States, but the two share more in common than most Canadians are aware of. Though slavery was different between the two North American colonies-turned countries, there can be no doubt that both Canada and the United States participated in the buying and selling of other human beings. The history of slavery in what is now Canada actually predates European settlement. It was common in Indigenous culture for one Indigenous nation to enslave people from other Indigenous nations, largely as captives in war. After being captured, the captives would be tortured. Some would be killed, but those who survived were enslaved. However, this slavery was different for a number of reasons. First, it was not based on race. Any captive could be enslaved. Second, children of slaves were not considered to also be slaves. And third, slaves could eventually be adopted into the Indigenous community, often through marriage to a member of the people who enslaved them. Indigenous slave owners in Eastern Canada did not consider their slaves property, a concept known as chattel slavery, but those on Canada's west coast did. Slavery among the European settlers in Canada lasted for around 200 years, beginning in the early 1600s. This included African slaves, but the majority were Indigenous slaves who had been sold to the settlers by other Indigenous nations in exchange for guns and other European goods. The settlers referred to their Indigenous slaves as Pawnees, which was the name of an Indigenous people who had been captured and sold to the settlers. Most Indigenous slaves were young, averaging around 14 years old. In 1689, King Louis XIV of France authorized the owning of slaves in French colonies, and a 1709 ordinance officially legalized slavery. Canada did not have plantations like the United States, but slave life was not much better, and many ran away to escape it. Ultimately, slavery in Canada was largely restricted to the elite, as the economy of Canadian colonies struggled to support it. Most Canadian settlers simply couldn't afford slaves. Slavery continued in Canada after Britain conquered the French colonies in 1763. It was not until 1834 that slavery was officially abolished in the British Empire, including Canada.